Hey, again. Now that the guns have mostly fallen silent and the desert has reclaimed the echoes of tanks and missiles, the story shifts from the battlefield to negotiation tables, conference rooms, and long-distance phone calls. It's quieter, subtler, and, for historians at least, endlessly fascinating in its slow, deliberate rhythm. The Yom Kippur War had left both Israel and Egypt bruised but not broken. The Third Army was trapped but alive. Israel had regained initiative but knew it could not expand without drawing international attention. And, more worryingly, a superpower intervention. The early shock of the surprise attack lingered in Tel Aviv, a sober reminder that intelligence failures could have catastrophic consequences in this quiet aftermath. Sadat began carefully shaping his post-war strategy. He knew that he could not defeat Israel militarily, but he could leverage Egypt's survival, the psychological impact of the war, and the visible encirclement of the Third Army into political influence. Egypt had regained dignity, and Sadat intended to convert that dignity into a diplomatic victory by early 1974. The groundwork for serious talks was being laid. Kissinger, the tireless shuttle diplomat, moved between Washington, Jerusalem, and Cairo, ferrying proposals, suggestions, and subtle threats. Every word mattered. Every pause had weight. The tone was understated but high stakes, like a game of chess played in slow motion. With the world watching, Israel, still grappling with its post-war vulnerability, approached these talks cautiously. Golda Meir and her cabinet understood that their tactical gains could easily turn into political liabilities. Crossing the canal had been audacious and successful, but any overreach could provoke the Soviets inflame Arab nationalism or undermine Israel's relationship with the United States. Every move needed to be calculated, measured, and carefully justified. In Cairo, Sadat projected calm, even confidence. The Third Army's situation was managed carefully to avoid disaster, but also to maintain leverage. International attention remained focused on Egypt's resilience. Sadat's skill lay in the optics, showing strength and strategic thinking even when the reality on the ground was messy, constrained, and far from absolute. The Camp David process would eventually emerge from this context. Although the actual meetings wouldn't occur until 1978, the seeds were planted now. Diplomatic contacts increased, proposals were quietly floated, and both sides tested the waters. Israel wanted to ensure security and prevent future surprises. Egypt wanted recognition, leverage, and a pathway to peace that preserved national pride. Meanwhile, the United States managed its dual roles, supporting Israel's security while also encouraging Egypt toward diplomacy. Washington's delicate balancing act included resupply operations, subtle warnings, and continuous pressure on both sides to avoid unilateral action. Every cargo plane, every arms shipment, every phone call was part of a larger quiet strategy. As the months passed, the war's lessons permeated political thinking. Israel re-evaluated intelligence protocols, contingency planning, and military readiness. Egypt reassessed its military strategy and focused on demonstrating resilience rather than seeking outright victory. Both nations began to appreciate that the true outcomes of this conflict would not be measured in miles gained or lost, but in the negotiation, leverage, and international perception they could generate. The Third Army, still trapped in the Sinai, became a symbol, not of defeat exactly, but of the fragile balance between military reality and political optics. Its presence reminded negotiators and leaders that tangible leverage on the ground often outweighed abstract battlefield victories. Back in Israel, public discourse reflected a similar duality. Citizens were relieved their country had survived the surprise attack, but remained painfully aware of their vulnerabilities. Leaders in Jerusalem emphasized recovery, intelligence reform, and careful diplomacy. The kind of work that is slow, methodical, and often underappreciated, but necessary for long-term stability. By late 1974, quiet diplomatic channels had matured into structured talks. Shuttle diplomacy increased. Ceasefire lines were formalized. Proposals for disengagement and troop withdrawals were floated and revised. Every negotiation was slow, deliberate, and, in many ways, almost hypnotically tedious. The kind of process that is perfect for a sleepy evening's narration. Yet beneath this quiet surface, the stakes remained immense. A misstep could ignite a renewed conflict, provoke superpower involvement, or unravel the fragile perception of Egyptian strength. Leaders on both sides understood that their moves now would shape the Middle East for decades. By early 1974, the ceasefire had mostly held, though mostly was a loose term. Small skirmishes still flared, radios crackled with reports of minor violations, and soldiers on both sides remained alert, sometimes nervously, sometimes with bored resignation. The desert seemed endless, and the days were long, repetitive, and occasionally punctuated by the dull thrum of engines or distant artillery. More ambience than threat at this point. Shuttle diplomacy, led almost single-handedly by Henry Kissinger, became the new battleground. Unlike tanks and missiles, here the weaponry was patience, phrasing, and timing. Every envoy carried proposals, counter-proposals, and careful suggestions. The language was meticulous, almost hypnotic in its monotony. Israel pushed for security guarantees and clearly defined borders. Their military had performed brilliantly under pressure, but they were painfully aware that overextension could invite disaster. They wanted a framework to prevent future surprise attacks, formal recognition of the ceasefire lines, and assurances that Egypt wouldn't rearm too quickly. Egypt, under Sadat's meticulous planning, had a different goal. The Third Army might have been trapped, but that didn't matter as much as perception. Sadat wanted recognition, legitimacy, and a political narrative that would elevate Egypt's status without exposing it to further military risk. The Third Army became a bargaining chip, a slow, deliberate reminder of leverage, used subtly to strengthen Egypt's negotiating position. Over the next several months, disengagement agreements began taking shape. Israeli forces slowly pulled back from certain positions, while Egypt redeployed units to the east bank of the canal under careful observation. The process was slow, sometimes painfully so, with each movement negotiated, verified, and then verified again. Soldiers marched and countermarched, commanders counted and recounted, and diplomats recorded every step like a very tedious chronicle. The gradual withdrawal was carefully staged. Israel secured buffer zones, establishing positions that would allow rapid response if hostilities resumed. Egypt managed to reposition its units in a way that maintained pride while avoiding outright confrontation. Both sides emerged with the ability to claim a kind of victory. Israel retained operational security and tactical awareness. Egypt preserved dignity and demonstrated resilience. Meanwhile, international oversight remained constant. Unobservers patrolled the newly drawn lines, occasionally filing reports that no one read very closely but that were symbolically important. The world watched quietly, relieved that the war had not spiraled further, but aware that the underlying tensions were far from resolved. Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy continued, painstakingly connecting the dots between military realities, political necessities, and personal egos. Negotiations at this stage were less about immediate victories and more about positioning for the longer game, the eventual peace process, the normalization of relations, and the creation of a framework that would prevent another surprise attack. Throughout this slow dance, Sadat's political acumen became evident. He converted Egypt's limited military gains into leverage, building international sympathy and recognition without engaging in further high-risk operations. Israel, while maintaining control over its security environment, learned humility and the importance of careful diplomacy alongside military readiness. By mid-1974, both sides could claim small but meaningful victories. Egypt had restored a sense of honor and emerged as a credible negotiating partner. Israel had stabilized its borders, secured strategic advantages, and reinforced the importance of intelligence reform. The war, which had started in chaos and bloodshed, had gradually transformed into a quiet series of adjustments, agreements, and incremental gains. The desert, once echoing with the roar of tanks and missiles, now returned to a calm monotony. Soldiers counted days, generals revised plans, and diplomats engaged in slow, hypnotic conversations that shaped the future of the region more than any battlefield ever could. This phase of disengagement and diplomacy set the stage for what would become Camp David, though still years away. The foundations were being laid here, trust slowly being tested, leverage quietly being measured, and the subtle art of negotiation taking precedence over direct confrontation. By late 1974, the Sinai was mostly quiet, at least in the sense that artillery had stopped roaring and tanks were no longer advancing at a reckless pace. Soldiers patrolled, observed, and occasionally grumbled about how uneventful life had become. The desert had returned to its slow, indifferent rhythm, indifferent to human strategy, diplomacy, or the subtle victories being quietly logged in dusty offices. The disengagement of forces between Israel and Egypt became the dominant focus. Positions were gradually recalibrated. Israel pulled back from the most exposed forward positions, establishing defensible buffer zones, while Egypt repositioned units in a way that preserved dignity without inviting renewed confrontation. Every movement was meticulously planned, verified and re-verified, almost hypnotically slow. The kind of process that could lull you to sleep if you were reading reports aloud. For Egypt, the Third Army's survival had already become a political symbol. Its encirclement might have looked like a tactical defeat, but Sadat reframed it as resilience. The army hadn't surrendered, hadn't been annihilated, and in doing so, it underscored Egypt's credibility on the world stage. Every carefully managed supply convoy, every cautious repositioning, reinforced the image of competence and endurance. Israel, on its side, had regained initiative, stabilized its borders, and quietly reinforced the lessons of the war. Intelligence protocols were overhauled, and military readiness was recalibrated. Golda Meir's cabinet emphasized the importance of measured responses, ensuring that Israel's newfound tactical advantage did not morph into reckless overreach. The Israeli public, slowly recovering from the psychological shock of the surprise attack, could now take solace in a restored sense of national security, albeit a more cautious, humbled version. Meanwhile, international diplomacy hummed along. Henry Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy became almost ritualistic, with endless flights, memos, and negotiations that were equal parts subtle pressure and painstaking patience. The United States maintained Israel's logistical lifeline while nudging both sides toward a durable settlement. The Soviets, too, maintained their quiet pressure on Egypt and Syria, reminding everyone that superpower oversight was now a constant background rhythm. By early 1975, formal agreements began to take shape. Troop disengagements were codified with clear terms, though minor skirmishes and violations still occurred. The desert, after all, had its own pace and ignored borders entirely. The careful balance allowed both nations to claim symbolic victories. Israel secured operational control and tactical security. Egypt preserved pride and maintained a visible military presence without suffering outright humiliation. These subtle victories laid the groundwork for the eventual Camp David negotiations. Sadat had converted the experience of the Yom Kippur War into tangible leverage. Egypt had survived, regained honor, and demonstrated that it could compel Israel and the world to take its interests seriously. Israel, in turn, had stabilized its situation, safeguarded its military gains, and learned that diplomacy could be as critical as battlefield prowess. Throughout this period, the rhythm of life was slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic. Soldiers counted supplies and mapped positions. Generals revised plans, reviewed lessons, and communicated cautiously with political leaders. Diplomats drafted, redrafted, and negotiated in careful, measured tones. Every step was part of the larger, quiet process of shaping a post-war reality. By mid-1975, the war had receded from the headlines, leaving behind lessons, scars, and the invisible threads of diplomacy that would eventually culminate in formal peace talks. The Yom Kippur War, loud and chaotic at first, had transformed into a slow, meticulous exercise in leverage, perception, and strategic patience. The desert, as always, remained indifferent. Tanks had cooled. Radios were mostly silent, and the Third Army waited, quietly emblematic of the delicate balance between battlefield reality and political perception. So, as concludes, we leave the Yom Kippur War behind, not with dramatic fireworks, but with the subtle, hypnotic rhythm of diplomacy, disengagement, and the quiet assertion of national pride. Both sides emerged with lessons, leverage, and the beginnings of the political pathways that would eventually lead to peace. The stage is now set. Camp David looms on the horizon. Leaders are ready to turn battlefield experience into political negotiation. And the Middle East prepares for a very different, slower kind of conflict, one fought with words, agreements, and careful calculation rather than artillery and tanks. By the middle of 1975, the Sinai had finally settled into what could generously be called normal. Soldiers patrolled positions that were carefully agreed upon, the desert stretching endlessly around them. Tanks, once roaring across the sand in frantic maneuvers, now sat mostly idle, rust quietly beginning to claim their metal forms. The hum of diplomacy had replaced the roar of war. Israel had secured its strategic objectives without overreaching, consolidating positions and ensuring that future surprise attacks would be far more difficult. Lessons were being learned in real time. Intelligence networks were being overhauled, supply lines strengthened, and command structures scrutinized with a newfound meticulous. The psychological blow of the initial surprise lingered, but it was tempered by the satisfaction of regained control. Egypt, for its part, had transformed a near disaster into political capital. The Third Army, though trapped, remained a visible symbol of resilience. Sadat's leadership highlighted competence and foresight, and the international community now saw Egypt as a credible, patient, and negotiating partner. Pride had been restored without the cost of outright annihilation, which, in diplomatic terms, was a subtle but powerful victory. The superpowers maintained their watchful presence. The US, through Kissinger's endless shuttle diplomacy, ensured Israel's security while nudging both sides toward negotiation. The Soviets maintained pressure on Egypt and Syria, demonstrating that global oversight had become an invisible, inescapable reality. Everyone knew that the consequences of missteps could extend far beyond the Sinai Desert. Formal agreements regarding troop disengagement and buffer zones were painstakingly drafted, revised, and monitored. Observers, maps, and memos became the new instruments of control. Violations were rare but noted, each minor infraction recorded like the tick of a very slow clock. Diplomacy now moved at a rhythm far slower than the chaos of combat, but in many ways more decisive. Through these quiet months, both Israel and Egypt extracted subtle victories. Israel reinforced security and recovered from the shock of initial failures. Egypt secured international recognition, preserved national honor, and demonstrated the practical value of strategic patience. Both nations now entered the next phase of regional history with positions strengthened by perception, preparation, and careful calculation. And so the stage for Camp David was set. The war had not produced clear-cut winners, but it had created the conditions for meaningful negotiation. The Third Army remained a reminder of leverage. The desert bore silent witness to past chaos, and leaders on both sides were ready to translate battlefield experience into diplomatic strategy. The story of the Yom Kippur War, loud, chaotic, and deadly at first, had quietly transformed into a slow, deliberate process of diplomacy, disengagement, and subtle political victories. The desert, indifferent as ever, stretched into the horizon, the sand covering tracks and burnt-out tanks alike. So, the desert has finally quieted, the guns have cooled, and the sand has swallowed most of the immediate traces of battle. But of course, wars don't really end when the last shell is fired. They move sideways, into offices, conference rooms, and private phone lines where leaders maneuver with the patience of chess players, who know that one misstep could topple the board. After the disengagement, agreements of 1974, 1975. Both Israel and Egypt found themselves in a peculiar limbo. On one hand, the immediate threat of renewed conflict had faded. On the other, neither side had achieved a decisive victory. The Yom Kippur War had exposed vulnerabilities, challenged myths of invincibility, and left both nations acutely aware that their actions now carried immense political weight. In particular, proved adept at turning military outcomes into diplomatic leverage. The Third Army remained a symbol, not of failure, but of endurance. Internationally, he framed Egypt's performance as evidence of strategic competence. Domestically, he bolstered national pride. Subtly, he positioned Egypt as a serious negotiating partner, capable of influencing the pace and terms of any political settlement. Israel, meanwhile, was recovering from the psychological shock of being caught off guard. Golda Meir and her cabinet were painstakingly rebuilding confidence in the military, overhauling intelligence operations, and ensuring that the lessons of 1973 were not quickly forgotten. Tactical gains had been achieved, but the memory of vulnerability lingered. The leadership knew that diplomacy would now be just as critical as battlefield readiness. Kissinger, ever the tireless shuttle diplomat, orchestrated a slow, deliberate process. Washington became the intermediary, ferrying messages, proposals, and gentle nudges between Jerusalem and Cairo. Every word mattered, every pause counted. The process was hypnotically slow, almost boring in its monotony, but vital. A single misphrased line could unravel months of careful positioning. Both Israel and Egypt understood the stakes. Israel wanted security guarantees, recognition of territorial realities, and assurances that Egypt would not seek immediate revenge. Egypt wanted political leverage, acknowledgement of its dignity, and, ideally, steps toward normalization without compromising strategic interests. Each side moved with caution, aware that the world was watching and that the superpowers were ever present in the background. The rhythm of this diplomacy was slow, almost subtle. Envoys traveled back and forth between capitals. Memos were drafted and redrafted, and minor concessions were discussed with agonizing deliberation. Observers described it as tedious, which, in this context, is another way of saying the very careful, necessary prelude to history-changing agreements. Behind the scenes, both nations quietly tested boundaries. Israel recalibrated its troop deployments, ensuring strategic advantage without appearing aggressive. Egypt monitored the international response to its moves, subtly signaling strength while avoiding confrontation. Each side measured its words, its gestures, and its patience, slowly nudging toward a framework that could support a long-term settlement. Meanwhile, the Cold War hovered quietly over the region. The United States and the Soviet Union maintained their logistical and political support, carefully balancing influence without overt interference. The presence of superpowers added a layer of pressure, forcing both Israel and Egypt to weigh every move against potential global consequences. One misstep could trigger intervention, escalate tensions, or destabilize the delicate post-war balance. As months passed, the groundwork for Camp David slowly solidified. Formal disengagement agreements had been implemented, minor disputes resolved, and communication channels established. Both sides had learnt the importance of patience, perception, and strategic framing. The Yom Kippur War's lessons were clear. Raw battlefield success is fleeting. Long-term influence comes from leverage, negotiation, and carefully managed optics. And so, the stage was set. Camp David would become the arena where these subtle calculations would be tested. The leaders would meet, not with guns or tanks, but with documents, proposals, and the ever-present awareness that history was watching. For now, the desert remained indifferent. Soldiers marched in measured steps, diplomats drafted with cautious precision, and the world waited. The Yom Kippur War had faded from the headlines, but its echoes were present in every handshake, memo, and quiet negotiation. This slow, almost hypnotic period of diplomacy demonstrates that wars often continue long after the last battle in the patient, meticulous work of leaders who understand that leverage, timing, and perception are just as important as artillery. As 1975 unfolded, the diplomatic rhythm between Cairo and Jerusalem became almost ritualistic. Henry Kissinger, never one to tire, crisscrossed the globe like a man possessed by a very slow, deliberate sense of purpose. Washington became a hub of carefully worded proposals, timing-sensitive phone calls, and subtle nudges aimed at ensuring that both sides stayed on track, or at least didn't spiral off into renewed conflict. Israel, still smarting from the surprise attack of October 1973, approached these negotiations cautiously. The leadership had learned two key lessons. First, that tactical brilliance could be undermined by intelligence failures. And second, that political savvy mattered as much as battlefield prowess. Golda Meir and her cabinet insisted on security guarantees, territorial recognition, and verification mechanisms for troop movements. Every step was measured, every pause deliberate, because no one wanted to risk a misstep that could undo months of careful disengagement. Sadat, meanwhile, quietly leveraged Egypt's position with finesse. The Third Army's survival had already become a symbol of resilience, and he now used it as a subtle bargaining tool. Every minor improvement in supply lines, every strategic repositioning, and every carefully framed statement to international media reinforced Egypt's credibility. Sadat was patient, almost theatrically so, demonstrating that slow, calculated pressure could achieve what rapid military advances could not. The shuttle diplomacy itself was hypnotically slow. Kissinger would fly to Cairo, discuss points for hours, take notes, return to Washington, review with advisors, then head to Jerusalem for another round of discussions. Documents were drafted, revised, and sometimes revised again for clarity, tone, or subtle emphasis. Minor concessions were floated, carefully observed, and occasionally retracted if one side reacted too strongly. The pace was intentionally tedious, the kind of slow-motion chess match that could lull an observer to sleep, though it shaped history quietly but decisively in these exchanges. Israel focused on maintaining the tactical security gains achieved during the war, while avoiding any appearance of overreach. Positions near the Suez Canal were consolidated and fortified. Strategic buffer zones were formalized, and contingencies for future contingencies were thoroughly mapped. The lesson from 1973 remained fresh. A surprise attack could upend even the most disciplined forces, and political fallout could be just as dangerous as battlefield losses. Egypt, for its part, balanced caution with assertiveness. Sadat was careful not to overplay his hand. The Third Army had to survive, but the optics of its encirclement had to remain a point of leverage. Every movement of troops, every statement to international media, every diplomatic gesture was carefully orchestrated to maintain pressure on Israel without provoking renewed hostilities. It was a masterclass in slow, deliberate negotiation, played out against the indifferent backdrop of the desert. Meanwhile, the Cold War hovered quietly in the background. The United States supplied Israel with weapons, logistics, and political support, while gently nudging them to accept diplomatic constraints. The Soviets remained equally attentive, supporting Egypt with military supplies and diplomatic advice, ensuring that the balance of power in the region remained visible but not overtly confrontational. The superpower's presence added a layer of tension, subtle but constant, reminding everyone that local decisions now carried global consequences. Over the next year, these patterns of negotiation and repositioning continued. Disengagement agreements were implemented, occasionally tested, and carefully observed by international monitors. Minor incidents were handled with careful diplomacy, avoiding escalation while reinforcing each side's sense of leverage. Both Israel and Egypt quietly extracted victories. Israel secured operational control and strengthened its intelligence and military posture, while Egypt gained diplomatic recognition, bolstered national pride, and established credibility as a negotiating partner. Through it all, the pace was hypnotic. Envoys traveled, memos circulated, and maps were endlessly updated. Soldiers counted days, repositioned slowly, and watched as the negotiations unfolded from their desert posts. Generals and political leaders analyzed every minor adjustment, considering not just immediate consequences, but long-term perception. History was moving, but at the pace of a slow, deliberate tide, inexorable, patient, and slightly sacrifice. By the end of this phase, the groundwork for Camp David had been firmly established. Both sides had defined objectives, recognized limitations, and cultivated leverage. The Yom Kippur War's immediate chaos had receded into a quiet, calculated diplomacy, a slow, unglamorous process that would ultimately produce more enduring results than the bullets and tanks ever could. By 1977, the groundwork was fully laid. The Sinai had quieted. The Third Army remained a careful symbol of leverage, and both Israel and Egypt had settled into a rhythm of slow, deliberate diplomacy. Soldiers patrolled positions with measured routine, generals revised contingency plans, and diplomats continued the hypnotic shuffle of memos, phone calls, and meetings that defined post-war negotiations. Sadat, ever deliberate, understood that perception could be more powerful than tanks. His careful management of the Third Army, his patience in negotiations, and his subtle public statements had elevated Egypt's position without firing another shot. International attention focused on Cairo's resilience, and Egypt was now seen as a serious partner in any peace initiative. A partner with leverage and credibility. Israel, meanwhile, had learned humility. The shock of 1973 had faded into lessons, embedded deeply in military doctrine and political decision-making. Tactical gains were preserved, intelligence networks reinforced, and the importance of diplomacy fully recognized. Golda Meir's successor, Menachem Begin, understood that any lasting security required more than operational strength. It required careful negotiation and the willingness to compromise where necessary. Shuttle diplomacy, led by Kissinger, continued to refine the terms of disengagement, verifying troop positions, buffer zones, and communication protocols. Each minor adjustment, each carefully worded message, was a slow, deliberate step toward what would eventually become Camp David. The rhythm of diplomacy now dominated, replacing the chaos of war with patient, measured negotiation. Both sides were preparing psychologically and politically for Camp David. Sadat needed a visible diplomatic victory, a way to transform the Yom Kippur War into lasting political leverage. Israel needed security guarantees and international recognition of its territorial reality, without appearing to concede too much. Every conversation, every memo, every diplomatic gesture was designed to preserve options while shaping outcomes. The desert, indifferent as always, stretched across Sinai and the Golan Heights. Tanks lay dormant, sand-covered tracks, and the Third Army waited quietly. Soldiers, generals, and diplomats alike moved through routines that seemed mundane but carried immense consequences. The war had ended, but history was still in motion, measured, patient, and almost hypnotically slow. The desert has quieted, troops have settled, and years of patient, almost tedious diplomacy have finally led to the point where world history could be nudged, ever so slowly, by the careful words of a few people sitting in a comfortable room. Welcome to Camp David. It was September 1978. The stage was a secluded presidential retreat in Maryland, chosen for its tranquility, isolation, and, frankly, its ability to make negotiations feel like a slow, meditative retreat rather than a high-stakes political confrontation. Menachem Begin, Prime Minister of Israel, arrived with carefully prepared talking points, maps, and contingency plans. Anwar Sadat, President of Egypt, arrived with a sense of theatrical patience, aware that his presence alone conveyed a quiet, powerful message. And Henry Kissinger, though no longer the primary negotiator, had helped prepare the terrain, a world accustomed to careful, slow shuttle diplomacy. Jimmy Carter, US President, oversaw the retreat with calm, almost monastic attention to detail. The setting was quiet, almost hypnotically serene, a sharp contrast to the chaos of Sinai deserts and battlefields. The negotiators would spend days, even weeks, in a rhythm of discussion, reflection, and slow compromise. Sadat, ever patient, knew that perception mattered as much as content. Egypt had survived the war, the Third Army had remained unvanquished, and now, in this isolated retreat, he could leverage that symbolic strength to secure real concessions. His approach was calm, deliberate, occasionally punctuated with dry humor that undercut tension just enough to keep the talks moving. Begin. Meanwhile, approached the negotiations with cautious pragmatism. Israel had recovered from the shock of 1973, strengthened its intelligence and military, and understood that lasting security required careful concessions. Begin's strategy involved balancing public expectations, military imperatives, and international pressures, all while maintaining a veneer of calm determination. The discussions themselves were slow, methodical, almost hypnotic. Every proposal was dissected, every phrase debated. Nothing happened quickly. Words were repeated, rephrased, and reflected upon. The participants understood that a hastily agreed sentence could have decades-long consequences. Every point was considered from multiple angles: security, political optics, domestic reception, and historical precedent. A key focus was the Sinai Peninsula. Israel controlled it after the 1967 war, but Egypt now demanded recognition and eventual return. Sadat framed this not just as territorial recovery, but as national honor, something that mattered greatly both domestically and internationally. Israel needed security guarantees in exchange, including early warning systems and demilitarized zones. The discussions, therefore, combined geography, military planning, and diplomacy into a slow, deliberate negotiation dance. Throughout Camp David, personal dynamics played a subtle role. Carter, ever the attentive mediator, kept both leaders on track, often repeating points slowly and patiently to ensure clarity. Sadat's calm, measured demeanor contrasted with Begin's cautious determination, creating a rhythm of dialogue that was hypnotically slow but strategically precise. Each day ended with progress measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small, incremental steps. Agreements on minor buffer zones, verification procedures, and wording of joint communiques were celebrated quietly. Every point gained represented hours of discussion, reflection, and subtle persuasion. The atmosphere, while calm, was occasionally punctuated with gentle tension. Misunderstandings were corrected politely, historical grievances mentioned carefully, and leverage subtly applied. Sadat's earlier experiences during the Yom Kippur War informed his approach. Patience, perception, and subtle pressure often worked better than blunt demands. Israel, still conscious of past vulnerabilities, matched these tactics with careful pragmatism. By the end of the first week, small victories accumulated for both sides. Egypt had gained recognition of its sovereignty over the Sinai. Israel had secured guarantees for security and monitoring. and both nations had demonstrated a capacity to negotiate without resorting to force. The Yom Kippur War's lessons were evident. Battlefield success was transient, but strategic leverage and careful negotiation could yield enduring results. As the days of Camp David passed, the negotiations became a rhythm in themselves. Slow, almost hypnotic, like watching sand slip through an hourglass. Each grain carrying the weight of national security and historical consequence. Discussions focused on every conceivable detail. The Sinai Peninsula, still fresh in everyone's minds, was dissected not with maps alone, but with imagined troop movements, border adjustments, and demilitarized zones. Sadat pressed gently but firmly for Egyptian sovereignty and gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces. Begin countered with careful demands for security guarantees, early warning systems, and the reassurance that Israel's military integrity would remain intact. Each point was argued with patience, repeated phrasing, and subtle reminders of previous positions, as if speaking too quickly might undo all progress. Kissinger's earlier shuttle diplomacy had laid a foundation, but at Camp David, the dialogue was direct, deliberate, and unhurried. Carter acted as moderator, repeating points in calm, almost soporific tones, ensuring that misunderstandings were clarified and that neither leader felt forced into concessions prematurely. Occasionally, minor disagreements flared, over phrasing, over maps, over historical claims. But they were resolved with gentle persistence, quiet reflection, and the occasional wry observation that diffused tension without dramatics. Sadat's strategy leaned heavily on symbolic leverage. The Third Army's survival, the memory of Egyptian resilience during the Yom Kippur War, and the careful framing of Egypt's moral and strategic position all served to strengthen his negotiating hand. He knew that subtle pressure, expressed through measured patience and calm insistence, often yielded more than aggressive demands ever could. Conversely, combine pragmatism with caution. Israel's military gains were non-negotiable, but security could be balanced with diplomatic progress. Repeatedly emphasized verification procedures, phased withdrawals, and operational safeguards, ensuring that Israel could maintain strategic stability while taking incremental steps toward peace. Every day at camp, David followed a predictable but carefully choreographed rhythm: discussions in the morning, reflection and drafting in the afternoon, minor revisions of agreements in the evening. Occasionally, leaders walked the grounds, spoke in quiet tones, or revisited contentious issues. Progress was measured not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in small, accumulative steps. Agreements on buffer zones here, joint statements there. Phrasing refined until neither side felt trapped or overexposed. The pace was hypnotic. Hours passed as language was debated, maps redrawn, and clauses carefully worded. Each concession, however minor, was strategically significant. Egypt secured recognition and a phased plan for regaining the Sinai. Israel secured security guarantees and monitoring mechanisms. Both sides emerged with symbolic and practical victories, each carefully preserved without public dramatics. By the end of the second week, a fragile, painstakingly negotiated framework was emerging. The Yom Kippur War, with all its chaos and tactical lessons, had been transformed into a foundation for negotiation. Both leaders understood the power of perception, victories on paper, careful language, and subtle leverage could achieve outcomes that battlefield maneuvers alone never could. By late September 1978, The Camp David negotiations were drawing to a close. After weeks of painstaking discussions, revisions, and careful reflection, both sides had crafted a framework that balanced Egypt's desire for sovereignty with Israel's need for security. The process, slow and deliberate, was almost mesmerizing in its rhythm. Proposals floated. Counterproposals considered, phrases adjusted for nuance, and agreements slowly accumulated like grains of sand in an hourglass. The key outcome, of course, was the agreement regarding the Sinai Peninsula. Israel agreed to a phased withdrawal from the territory it had occupied since 1967, returning it to Egyptian control over a period of time. Egypt, in return, recognized Israel's right to exist and committed to peaceful relations. It was not a dramatic, immediate transformation, sudden border changes or instant celebrations, but a carefully staged, meticulously managed transition that reflected months of patient negotiation. Beyond territorial adjustments, security arrangements were detailed and precise. Demilitarized zones were established, monitoring procedures implemented, and contingency plans outlined. Israel secured early warning stations. Egypt gained the reassurance of international oversight, and both nations could claim tangible, measured victories. Every clause, every line of text, was considered carefully to prevent future misunderstandings and to maintain balance. Sadat left Camp David with a quiet, yet unmistakable triumph. The Third Army, symbolic throughout the disengagement, had helped secure a stronger diplomatic position. Egypt regained the Sinai, restored national pride, and earned recognition as a competent negotiating partner. The war, which had threatened humiliation and disaster in 1973, had been transformed into leverage that produced real, enduring results. Begin, too, could claim a subtle victory. Israel retained security and operational advantage, while demonstrating the capacity to negotiate and compromise without appearing weak. The shock of 1973 had forced humility, and Camp David showcased a new strategic maturity, one where dialogue, patience, and carefully applied leverage could achieve lasting results alongside military readiness. The accords themselves were formalized in a series of carefully worded documents. Public announcements followed, emphasizing peace, cooperation, and a new era for the Middle East. Media coverage, speeches, and ceremonial handshakes highlighted a sense of accomplishment, but beneath the surface, the real work had been the slow, deliberate negotiation, the careful management of perception, leverage, and incremental agreements. Internationally, the world observed with muted relief. The superpowers had watched from the sidelines, their influence felt but never overtly exercised. The agreements demonstrated that even after intense conflict, patience, persistence, and quiet diplomacy could yield outcomes more enduring than battlefield victories. Camp David had ended. Leaders had shaken hands, signed carefully worded documents, and returned to their capitals with a sense of cautious accomplishment. But of course, signing papers does not immediately erase the memory of war, nor does it instantly transform political landscapes. Both Israel and Egypt now had to manage domestic reactions, strategic recalibrations, and the long, slow process of turning agreements into reality. In Egypt, Sadat returned to Cairo as a quiet hero. Public celebrations were muted, at least compared to the traditional fanfare of military victory, because the country had just emerged from a war that had inflicted losses and shaken confidence. Nevertheless, Sadat skillfully framed the return of the Sinai as a triumph of diplomacy and national pride. Newspapers emphasized that Egypt had regained its territory, preserved its military dignity, and forced Israel to acknowledge its sovereignty. Every citizen, soldier, and bureaucrat was reminded that patient negotiation could achieve what brute force alone sometimes could not. There were dissenting voices, naturally. Some military officers, still mindful of battlefield hardships, grumbled about compromises or what they perceived as concessions. Intellectuals debated whether the peace was genuine or merely a temporary lull. But Sadat managed these murmurs with calm precision, emphasizing stability, international recognition, and Egypt's enhanced role on the global stage. Slowly, domestic acceptance solidified, reinforced by tangible gains and a careful narrative that linked patience with strategic success in Israel. Reactions were more complex. The public, still aware of the shock of 1973, was relieved by the security guarantees and careful withdrawal arrangements. Politicians and military leaders, however, were quietly divided. Some celebrated Begin's ability to secure recognition and negotiate effectively. Others worried that territorial concessions could compromise long-term security. The balance was delicate, as Israel had to maintain domestic confidence while honoring agreements with a country that had once inflicted devastating losses. The military itself adapted slowly. Lessons from the Yom Kippur War had been partially codified before Camp David, but now practical adjustments followed. Troop deployments were reviewed, intelligence procedures tightened, and contingency planning was refined. The war had taught Israel to expect the unexpected and to value patience alongside operational strength. Camp David reinforced that strategic patience could be just as powerful as battlefield prowess. Internationally, the world's attention lingered. Superpowers quietly observed the implementation of the accords, ensuring that leverage remained balanced and that neither side acted precipitously. Diplomatic channels remained active, minor incidents were monitored, and both Israel and Egypt were subtly reminded that any misstep could invite global scrutiny. This constant, low-level oversight contributed to the slow, deliberate pace of peace implementation. Meanwhile, the psychological impact of the Yom Kippur War persisted. Soldiers on both sides returned to routines that were less chaotic, but still cautious. The desert, indifferent as always, remained a silent witness to past chaos and ongoing adjustments. Strategic positions were maintained, but with an awareness that diplomacy had now replaced most overt military action. Leaders had learned that while war could compel immediate results, negotiation produced lasting influence, a subtle, hypnotic lesson that unfolded over months and years. The Sinai itself became a slow, ongoing project. Withdrawal phases were carefully scheduled, buffer zones maintained, and verification mechanisms implemented. Every troop movement, every checkpoint, was observed and recorded. Progress was incremental, almost sleepy in its rhythm, yet each step carried strategic significance. The war's aftermath had transformed into a meticulous dance of patience and calculated adjustments. After the agreements were signed, the real work began. Agreements on paper are one thing. Turning them into reality is another. Israel and Egypt had committed two-phased troop withdrawals, demilitarized zones, and verification procedures. These measures were carefully planned and meticulously monitored, almost ritualistic in their pace. In the Sinai, Israel began withdrawing forces in stages. Tanks, artillery, and troops were moved back slowly, deliberately, as international observers documented every step. Egyptian forces re-entered, reclaimed areas in a similarly measured fashion. ensuring that the process reflected careful coordination rather than sudden, potentially destabilizing action. Each movement was logged, verified, and reported. The rhythm was hypnotic, like watching a clock tick through years instead of hours. Minor incidents occurred, of course. Border guards occasionally misinterpreted patrol movements. Checkpoints were slightly misaligned, and small disputes arose over access or jurisdiction. But these issues were managed with calm diplomacy, careful communication, and a shared recognition that mistakes were not emergencies but routine aspects of slow post-war adjustment. Each resolution reinforced the underlying lesson of the Yom Kippur War. Patience, planning, and procedural rigor could prevent renewed conflict. Domestically, both nations adjusted gradually. Egypt celebrated the return of the Sinai, but infrastructure repairs, administrative control, and public acclamation to new borders required months of effort. In Israel, the public followed troop movements with cautious optimism, aware that security could not be guaranteed instantly. Military units were retrained for new defensive positions, and intelligence networks recalibrated to account for the changed geopolitical landscape. The political atmosphere remained delicate. Sadat and Begin maintained lines of communication, exchanging updates and occasionally subtle reminders of obligations and expectations. Carter and the US continued to observe, ensuring compliance and encouraging trust. The pace remained slow, almost hypnotically so, reflecting the care both sides had learned was necessary after the chaos of 1973. Psychologically, the lessons of the war persisted. Soldiers who had fought, witnessed incitements, or survived intense engagements now applied that experience to routine operations. Commanders emphasized vigilance without panic, preparation without haste. The desert itself, silent and vast, seemed to reinforce this patient rhythm, indifferent to human effort but witnessing every minor maneuver. Internationally, the accords were hailed as a triumph of diplomacy, even if the process itself was anything but dramatic. Superpowers subtly reinforced compliance through economic, political, and military channels, ensuring that both Israel and Egypt respected agreements. This quiet oversight was never intrusive, but provided a background of accountability, reinforcing the hypnotic rhythm of incremental progress. By the end of this phase, both nations had adapted to a new normal. Israel had preserved security and operational readiness. Egypt had regained territory and international recognition. Minor disputes had been resolved without escalation, proving that careful management could prevent chaos. And the lessons of the Yom Kippur War, about preparation, perception, and the power of patience, continued to inform military, political, and diplomatic strategies. By the early 1980s, the Sinai was quiet. The phased withdrawals were complete, checkpoints and observation posts were in place, and both Israel and Egypt had adapted to a rhythm that balanced security with diplomacy. The war's immediate chaos had faded, replaced by a steady, deliberate pace of governance, monitoring, and public reassurance. Sadat's careful narrative framing ensured that Egypt's population saw the return of the Sinai as a triumph, even if it came through negotiation rather than battlefield glory. National pride was restored, and Egypt's image on the international stage was enhanced. The lessons of patience, subtle leverage, and strategic diplomacy were reinforced for generations of leaders and diplomats. In Israel, the Yom Kippur War remained a vivid memory. But Camp David and the subsequent implementation of agreements demonstrated that security and peace could coexist. Slowly, carefully, and without the need for dramatic confrontation. The military adapted, intelligence networks strengthened, and political leadership learned the value of negotiation alongside operational readiness. The international community continued to watch. The United States maintained its role as a guarantor and mediator, subtly reinforcing compliance and stability. The Soviet Union, while less directly involved, observed closely, ensuring its regional allies understood that diplomatic maneuvering now had consequences equal to military action for both nations. The post-war period became a study in careful management, incremental progress, and the enduring influence of perception. Soldiers maintained routines, generals monitored borders, and diplomats continued subtle exchanges, all part of a rhythm that was quiet, almost soporific, but profoundly significant. The Sinai and the immediate Israel-Egypt dynamic had settled into a quiet rhythm. Tanks were stationary, soldiers marched in measured steps, and diplomats filed endless memos. But the story of the Yom Kippur War didn't stop at the borders of Israel and Egypt. Syria, the superpowers, and the broader Middle East were all watching, adjusting and responding slowly, deliberately, and in ways that were sometimes subtle enough to lull an observer into a near-sleepy trance. Syria, still smarting from the loss in 1973, maintained a heightened state of military readiness along the Golan Heights. Hafez al-Assad, who had solidified his control over the country in the early 1970s, understood that Syria had narrowly avoided disaster and that lessons from the war would shape military doctrine for decades. Troop rotations, intelligence gathering, and defensive positioning became the order of the day. The memory of rapid Israeli advances lingered, but so did a cautious optimism. Diplomacy and strategic patience could potentially yield outcomes as meaningful as direct confrontation. The Soviet Union, Syria's primary backer, continued to provide military and logistical support, ensuring that Assad's regime remained confident and capable. At the same time, Moscow quietly assessed the changing regional balance. The disengagement agreements and Camp David outcomes highlighted the United States' growing influence, which required subtle recalibration of Soviet strategies. Weapons, shipments, advisory roles, and diplomatic engagement were all maintained with meticulous attention to timing, optics, and strategic leverage. The United States, having orchestrated and facilitated Camp David, now assumed the role of long-term guarantor. Washington provided military aid, technical assistance, and political support to Israel, while subtly reinforcing Egypt's commitment to peace. American influence became an invisible but persistent force, shaping regional dynamics without dramatic displays, a slow, deliberate projection of power that was as effective as it was unassuming. Other regional players watched quietly, taking notes. Jordan, Lebanon, and the smaller Gulf states assessed the implications of the new Israel-Egypt dynamic. Each adjusted policies, military postures, and diplomatic strategies in response, often in ways imperceptible to casual observers, but significant in shaping the region's slow-moving political currents. The broader lesson of the Yom Kippur War and Camp David began to ripple outward. Military victories were fleeting, but carefully negotiated agreements, subtle leverage, and patient diplomacy produced durable influence. Every troop movement, diplomatic note, and bilateral agreement was now evaluated not just for immediate tactical impact, but for long-term strategic significance. Even the superpower rivalry was transformed, at least regionally. The United States demonstrated that it could broker agreements that stabilized contested borders without direct military intervention. The Soviet Union showed restraint, supporting allies while avoiding escalation that could provoke a broader conflict. Both powers had learned, quietly and incrementally, the hypnotic power of patience and careful negotiation. Lessons the Middle East itself was now internalizing. Meanwhile, Israel and Egypt continued their quiet adjustments. Troops rotated, borders were monitored, and verification mechanisms remained in place. Civilians adjusted to new realities, administrators implemented policies, and diplomats engaged in low-level ongoing communications to prevent misunderstandings. It was a rhythm almost soporific in its consistency, but each measured action reinforced stability. After the war and Camp David, the Middle East entered a slow period of recalibration. Economically, both Israel and Egypt faced pressures that required careful management. Israel, having mobilized ostensibly during the 1973 war, worked to rebuild its economy while maintaining a robust military posture. Defense budgets remained high, but so did investments in infrastructure and civil planning, a balancing act of readiness and normalcy. Executed in steady, almost monotone increments, Egypt, recovering from war expenditures and the costs of Camp David implementation, focused on infrastructure in the Sinai and national rebuilding. Sadat understood that symbolic victories were important, but economic stability was equally crucial. Roads, ports, and administration in the Sinai had to be established and staffed. These tasks, though mundane and almost soporifically slow, reinforced Egypt's sovereignty and strengthened the practical foundations of peace, military. Realignments also continued quietly. Israel maintained positions in the Negev and along new buffer zones, while Egypt recalibrated forces near the Sinai without provoking alarm. Joint observation mechanisms, initially a source of skepticism, gradually became routine. Soldiers became accustomed to procedural monitoring rather than direct confrontation. The lessons of 1973 about surprise attacks, intelligence failures, and rapid escalation had seeped into doctrine, producing a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm of readiness. The arms market reflected these changes as well. Israel received continued American support, upgrading air forces, intelligence capabilities, and defensive systems. Egypt, meanwhile, maintained ties with the Soviet Union while selectively modernizing its forces to project strength without threatening Israel. Every deal, shipment, and strategic move was deliberate, carefully timed, and analyzed for potential regional reactions. Even economic aid packages were intertwined with military and diplomatic considerations, reinforcing the subtle interplay of influence and control. Politically, the war and Camp David reshaped internal narratives. Israel's government emphasized the importance of readiness and diplomacy, embedding lessons from 1973 into policy and national consciousness. Egypt's leadership framed the Sinai return as a triumph of patience and strategic foresight. Across the region, leaders of neighboring countries quietly adapted strategies, observing that negotiation and symbolic leverage could often yield results more enduring than direct confrontation. Tensions, naturally, persisted but in subtle ways. Minor incidents along borders, small diplomatic disputes, and occasional media provocations served as reminders that the peace was delicate. Each instance was managed with measured responses, military restraint, diplomatic notes, and quiet signaling, reinforcing that patience and procedure were now the preferred instruments of regional influence. Internationally, The US continued to act as a guarantor, quietly providing support and oversight. The Soviet Union maintained alliances and influence, but with subtle restraint, avoiding direct confrontation while ensuring regional partners remained aligned. Superpower involvement became a background hum rather than dramatic intervention, a slow and steady presence that reinforced stability. By the early 1980s, the Middle East was in a phase of slow, hypnotic consolidation. Economies were stabilizing, military forces were adjusted to new realities, and diplomatic channels remained active but unhurried. The Yom Kippur War's lessons about preparation, patience, perception, and leverage had diffused throughout the region. The desert, still indifferent, stretched across Sinai, Golan, and beyond, silently observing the quiet rhythm of rebuilding, negotiation, and adjustment. By the early 1980s, the Middle East had settled into a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. The immediate chaos of the Yom Kippur War had faded. Camp David had been implemented, and now nations were adjusting to a new political and military landscape, gradually, carefully, and sometimes in ways so subtle you might barely notice them if you blinked. In Israel, the lessons of 1973 continued to shape military doctrine and political strategy. Troops rotated through familiar buffer zones. Intelligence networks became more sophisticated, and generals emphasized preparedness without panic. Political leaders highlighted the importance of negotiation alongside operational readiness, ensuring that diplomacy complemented military strength rather than being overshadowed by it. Economically, Israel balanced reconstruction with continued defense spending. The war had exposed vulnerabilities, and the government was careful to maintain both civilian infrastructure and military capability. Roads were repaired, settlements adjusted, and defense industries continued production, all in a deliberate rhythm that mirrored the measured pace of diplomacy. Citizens adjusted to these new priorities, gradually incorporating them into daily life. Egypt, for its part, solidified control over the Sinai. Administrative infrastructure was established, military positions stabilized, and Sadat continued to frame the post-war period as a triumph of patience and foresight. Domestic politics remained delicate. While most celebrated the symbolic and practical return of the Sinai, dissenting voices occasionally raised concerns about concessions or reliance on international guarantees. Sadat managed these murmurs with calm, deliberate messaging, reinforcing stability and national pride. Syria continued to monitor developments closely. Hafez al-Assad maintained forces along the Golan Heights, modernized capabilities with Soviet assistance, and adopted a cautious but vigilant stance. Syria's posture reflected a subtle understanding. The war had demonstrated the costs of miscalculation, and patient, measured strategies were now paramount. The superpowers maintained their quiet influence. The US continued to provide military and diplomatic support to Israel, while ensuring Egypt's compliance and stability. The Soviet Union supplied Syria and monitored regional alignments, calibrating involvement to avoid direct confrontation but maintain influence. This balance of indirect oversight created a rhythm of regional tension that was present but never explosive, subtle, persistent, and hypnotically steady. Meanwhile, smaller states in the Middle East adjusted quietly. Jordan, Lebanon, and Gulf states observed, recalibrated alliances, and adapted military planning. The war and subsequent diplomacy had sent a clear message. Direct confrontation carried high risks, but patient negotiation and strategic alignment could yield meaningful influence. These lessons were absorbed slowly, like sediment settling in a calm river internationally. Economic aid, arms deals, and diplomatic channels continued at a careful, deliberate pace. Israel's procurement of advanced defense systems, Egypt's infrastructural investments, and Syria's cautious military modernization all reflected an understanding that stability required patience and measured action. The Yom Kippur War's psychological imprint endured. Soldiers, generals, and civilians remembered the suddenness of conflict, the shock of rapid advances, and the importance of vigilance. Camp David had demonstrated that negotiation could achieve lasting results. But the memory of October 1973 ensured that caution remained, ingrained in strategy and planning by the mid-1980s. The region had settled into a slow-moving equilibrium. Borders were respected, agreements monitored, and incidents resolved without escalation. Political leaders emphasized diplomacy, military leaders emphasized preparedness, and populations adjusted to a new, quieter normal. The desert, still indifferent, stretched beyond Sinai, Golan, and beyond national boundaries, silently observing the gradual unfolding of history. By the late 1980s, the Middle East had settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm. The immediate shocks of the Yom Kippur War were long past, and the agreements from Camp David had been implemented. Borders were largely respected, troops rotated through routine positions, and verification mechanisms had become standard practice, almost mundane, yet essential for maintaining the fragile peace. Israel's political and military leadership continued to internalize the lessons of 1973. Preparedness became institutionalized. Intelligence networks were refined, and the military remained vigilant, though rarely exercised at the dramatic levels seen during the war. Civilians, meanwhile, had incorporated this cautious stability into daily life. With the memory of sudden conflict lingering quietly in collective consciousness, Egypt enjoyed a period of relative stability. The Sinai's return was complete, infrastructure established, and the economy gradually stabilized. Sadat's diplomatic legacy endured, though internal political challenges persisted. The country had demonstrated that patient negotiation and strategic leverage could achieve symbolic and practical victories. Lessons now deeply embedded in national policy and public perception, Syria maintained its defensive posture along the Golan Heights, with Soviet support ensuring military readiness without provoking escalation. Assad's regime internalized the lessons of 1973. Sudden action carried risks, and careful, measured strategies could preserve influence and credibility. Neighboring states, too, adapted gradually, observing that patient diplomacy and strategic positioning often outweighed direct confrontation. The superpowers continued to influence the region, subtly and persistently. The US reinforced Israel's security and encouraged Egypt's compliance with agreements, while the Soviet Union maintained influence over Syria and other allies. Their involvement was never overtly dramatic, more like a quiet hum in the background, shaping outcomes through patience, leverage, and careful observation. Economically, both Israel and Egypt balanced recovery with security concerns. Defense budgets, infrastructure projects, and civilian priorities all moved forward in a deliberate, almost hypnotic rhythm. Arms, deals, aid packages, and diplomatic negotiations proceeded steadily, without the urgency or panic of wartime exigencies. The psychological impact of the war continued to ripple through society. Soldiers, commanders, and civilians remembered the lessons of surprise, rapid escalation, and operational vulnerability. Camp David had shown that negotiation could achieve lasting results. But the memory of conflict ensured that caution and vigilance remained constant companions by the end of the decade. The Middle East had entered a slow-moving equilibrium. The Yom Kippur War's lessons, the value of preparation, perception, patience, and strategic leverage, were fully absorbed into regional strategies. Borders were respected, agreements maintained, and the desert, silent and indifferent, stretched beyond national boundaries, quietly observing the measured unfolding of history. Hey there, one last time. We've drifted through the deserts, the negotiations, the troop movements, and the quiet rhythms of post-war adjustment. Now, let's settle into the long-term consequences, the subtle shifts, and the enduring legacy of the Yom Kippur War and Camp David. All of it unfolding slowly, methodically, like history itself breathing. By the 1990s, the Middle East had internalized much of the Yom Kippur War's lessons. Israel, having absorbed the shock of 1973 and the careful compromises of Camp David, continued to invest in intelligence, military modernization, and strategic alliances. Borders were monitored, agreements respected, and the population, while aware of persistent threats, had settled into a rhythm of cautious normalcy. Egypt's trajectory was equally deliberate. The Sinai remained under Egyptian control, integrated administratively and economically into the country. Sadat's assassination in 1981, a reminder that political stability is never guaranteed, was followed by Hosni Mubarak's long tenure, which maintained the careful balance of diplomacy, national security, and economic management. Peace with Israel endured almost superficially steady, proving that patience and careful negotiation could outlast even the most dramatic domestic upheavals. Syria maintained a posture of vigilance and subtle influence. Assad continued modernizing forces, calibrating alliances, and keeping a careful eye on Israel and neighboring countries. The war's memory lingered in military doctrine, emphasizing preparedness, observation, and the value of incremental adjustments over sudden aggression. Internationally, the superpowers continued their subtle dance. The United States maintained influence through military aid, political guidance, and strategic alliances, while the Soviet Union, and later Russia, continued to exercise measured involvement. Conflicts were avoided not by dramatic intervention, but by patient monitoring, careful negotiation, and strategic leverage. Lessons drawn directly from the post-1973 experience. Other regional players, from Jordan to the Gulf states, adapted to this slow rhythm of diplomacy and military readiness. Wars had taught that direct confrontation could be costly and unpredictable. Negotiation, perception, and incremental action became the primary instruments of influence, quietly shaping regional dynamics. The Yom Kippur War also left a cultural and psychological legacy. Societies remembered the vulnerability, the chaos, and the intensity of October 1973. Leaders remembered the strategic surprises, the costs of misjudgment, and the importance of intelligence and preparation. Camp David demonstrated that diplomacy, patience, and subtle leverage could produce results as enduring as battlefield victories. These lessons were absorbed into national consciousness, military doctrine, and political strategy. Economically, both Israel and Egypt continued rebuilding and modernizing. Defense industries, infrastructure projects, and public investments moved forward with steady, measured progress. Minor crises were managed deliberately, conflicts avoided when possible, and agreements respected with quiet precision by the mid-1990s. The Middle East's pace was almost soporific. Borders were defined, alliances measured, and diplomacy carefully maintained. Tensions still existed, of course, small incidents, regional disputes, and political debates. But they were largely managed through routine procedures rather than sudden escalation. The lesson of 1973, repeated over decades, was clear. Patience, preparation, and procedural rigor often mattered more than speed or drama. The desert, indifferent as ever, stretched beyond the Sinai, the Golan Heights, and beyond human imagination. It bore silent witness to decades of measured, deliberate history. Soldiers marched, diplomats negotiated, leaders calculated, and life continued. The Yom Kippur War, once a flash of sudden conflict, had transformed into a rhythm of patience, vigilance, and slow, hypnotic influence. And so, our 3-hour journey concludes. The war, the negotiations, the phased withdrawals, and the decade-long adjustments all point to a single, enduring truth. History often moves not in dramatic leaps, but in slow, deliberate increments. Lessons are absorbed quietly, agreements endure when implemented carefully, and influence is maintained through patience, perception, and subtle action as you settle in. Perhaps with lights dimmed and the desert stretching endlessly in your imagination. Remember this: the Yom Kippur War was not just a battle, nor was Camp David merely a negotiation. Together, they created a long, slow rhythm of consequence, shaping the Middle East in ways both subtle and enduring, almost like the gentle passage of time itself.